I want to thank you all for joining me at this very early hour for gamers at 9:30. I know staying up all night long and playing video games, sometimes it's hard to get up for this, but thanks for joining us. So my talk today is on what developers can learn from competitive gaming. And to give you kind of an idea of where I'm coming from and why I'm giving this talk, I'm a competitive gamer at heart. I grew up during the 90s when consoles had 4 controller ports, and I was the oldest of 5 brothers. So being able to win was pretty important. It meant you got to stay on the console and keep playing. If you lost, you were off, somebody else got to jump on. I started playing in tournaments back in the arcades in the early 90s, and I've been involved in competitive gaming ever since. I got my start in the game industry working for Major League Gaming. I was kind of a tournament player for Super Smash Brothers when I was in college, and I started running tournaments for it, and they brought me on to help run the events, and I transitioned from that. I was studying media in college to doing broadcasting for them, doing writing, doing some podcasts, that sort of thing, and helping manage their community. So since I left Major League Gaming in 2007, I've moved on to working in development. At some point I said, I want to stop writing about other people's games and I want to start making my own. There were some things where I'd look at stuff and I'd say, this isn't right, I want to change this. But when you're just a fan, you don't have a lot of influence over those things. So you need to get out there and get into the industry and really get some experience so you know for sure whether what you say isn't right, and to make the changes that you feel like would make a better game. So that's what I did. I moved out and did that. And mostly since then, work has been in casual and mobile. Actually, this gentleman in the back here, he spoke yesterday about how they're not all AAA games. Brilliant talk. It was a lot of folks really needed to hear that because there's a lot of people that have stars in their eyes about what the game industry is. A lot of times work isn't in the game that you want to make, it's in something else. So you need to be able to take pride in that and enjoy that. And I've been able to do that the last few years as a designer. And I've actually produced some games that have been #1 hits on bigfishgames.com, which is a casual gaming portal. And I've also produced titles that were in the featured list for iTunes App Store. So done some cool stuff since then, but my passion is still in competitive gaming, and that's really where I've focused a lot of my kind of design thought on the side when I'm kind of doing my own ideas and I'm building my own design documents. I'm doing stuff like that in my free time. I am a fast talker, so stop me if I'm going too fast. Sometimes my words will run together, and we've got lots of things to cover this morning, so how about some audience participation? You, my man. If I get talking too fast, you don't understand me, start doing this. It'll remind me to slow down, okay? I'm also local to Raleigh. I live just about 10 minutes from here in Garner. And when my daughter was born about 2 years ago, I went freelance, so I've been doing that ever since. I just completed a contract with National Geographic doing some games for them. Mostly PC downloadable, Mac downloadable stuff, but we also did a kids MMO last year called Animal Jam. So if any of you guys have kids that are under 10, I'd suggest they give it a look. The bad news is, though, which you've kind of already heard, is I've reproduced. There's more than one of me, and I've actually got a son due any day now. My wife is like 38 and a half weeks pregnant, and we were early with the last one, so I'm keeping my phone on, and if it rings, I apologize, but she may be going to labor, so if I have to run out of here at any second, I'm just going to pick somebody, and you're going to come up here and finish the talk for me, okay? So why should you care about competitive gamers? Some people that you want to get in your head that it's just it's one niche audience, and that's really all that matters for those people. And so maybe it doesn't apply to you. But if you look at the world of gaming, multiplayer games, what's in the collective consciousness at least, it's dominated by multiplayer games. And we learned yesterday that most of the games out there that you're developing are not necessarily that. But there's this mind share that is dominated by these competitive multiplayer games. And there's a lot of great examples here that I'm showing. And if you look at kind of the top console sales of this last generation, these are the top 5 games for each one. When I move to the next slide, you're going to see the games that have a significant multiplayer are in red. So top sales of a lot of these games, multiplayer is a big part of them, and people care about multiplayer. And even if the multiplayer lessons don't necessarily apply, even if what you learn from this lesson is I don't want to do that with my game, there might be some good points in this that you would want to pay attention to. Another thing to consider is when you're making a game that's got multiplayer, your budget might be 80% dedicated to the single player content and only 20% dedicated to the multiplayer content, depending on where you're at, what studio. If you read the note here, that'll kind of give you an idea of where I'm coming from with these figures, but this is based on conversations I've had with other developers, folks that I've talked to. Meanwhile, the player investment, if multiplayer is one of your key one of your key selling features, when the players get a hold of the game, what they're going to do is they're going to spend 10% beating that single player mode once, and they're going to spend the rest of the time that they have your game playing the multiplayer modes. And this is the way that I play games. I tend to get a game, sometimes I don't even finish the single player, but I'll put 100 hours into the multiplayer mode. So for some games, what you're looking at here is there's a big gap between where you're investing your money and where the players are investing their time. So if you don't want to go in and have a fight with your producers about where we're spending the money and all that type of stuff, what you need to do is get better at multiplayer design so that you can spend less and do more. So this is another good reason to pay attention to this. Also, if competitive gaming spawned an international multi-million-dollar marketing industry, and there's direct and indirect benefits to developers based on this market. These guys, they're putting it up on their website, they're promoting it, they're showing your company logo, they're showing your game's logo, they're promoting things. Basically, it's millions of dollars in free advertising for your studio. And for some studios, for some of these things, if they're doing a television deal or something like that, they're going to come to you and they're going to license the rights to air your game on the air. So if you create an excellent multiplayer game and you put it out there and it ends up on one of these leagues, there's an opportunity for you to make direct money off of it. Indirectly, you also get an opportunity to see what people who don't care about all like the social rules that get into multiplayer games, what people that really just like dig into it and find what's really core about it, what's the most important thing about it, you get to see how they're playing. So you get to learn as a designer what the emergent principles were from the game design that you created, and it's going to help you make a better game later on. And of course, you want your customers to have fun, and if you can make a better multiplayer game, fun's your ultimate goal, right? This is an entertainment industry. Unless you're over in the serious games track and you're worried about training people, what you're making games for is you want them to have fun. So a better multiplayer game hopefully is going to be more fun for people. So a few caveats here. This is an overview. I could probably take each of these points and spend a full hour-long lecture talking about it with you, but I want to try and hit on some big points and get you guys thinking about it, get you investigating it yourself. And these are suggestions, they're not hard rules. Game development is both a science and an art, right? So sometimes you have to break a rule to make a better game. And sometimes you have to really think outside the box to create something that's exciting. So don't just take these as gospel truth, because I'm a guy who's been involved in competitive gaming for 15 years and been a professional game developer for the last 5. Look at it as an opportunity to learn some of the lessons that I've learned. And I don't work at your studio. Every studio has different personnel, they have different resources, they have different time frames. Sometimes you're developing a game in 3 months and it's a mad blitz. Sometimes you've got a year and a half, or it's a game that your studio is working on the side and you've got lots of time to play with it. So you need to do what works for your studio. Don't stick to these, again, as hard rules that we have to do this. You also need to consider your goals and your audience. If you're making a kart racer game for children under 12, some of these rules apply, but not all of them do. So you need to make sure that you evaluate your goals when you're going into this and making sure that you're developing a game that's appropriate for your audience. So what do competitive gamers want? We have to understand the gamer before we really understand what we're learning from them. So these slides are a little bit dense, but I think I'm building a good case here if you'll stick with me. The first point is obviously they want to have fun. That's why they're playing a game. But competitive gamers, they want to compete. They go in, the fun for them comes out of going in, engaging in competition with other people. It's just like people who go and play a sport. Like I was saying before we started, I play soccer. I played in college, and I still play not because I'm going to be a professional soccer player, but because I enjoy it. And obviously when I go to play, I want to win. Like, that's my goal. I'm going out there to have fun, to compete, to win. And whether I win or lose, I want to learn something. I have lost some of the skills that I had when I was playing soccer before, and so when I go in and I'm competing again, I'm learning what my 30-year-old body can do that my 20-year-old body used to be able to do, and what my 30-year-old body can't do. So I'm learning as I'm playing, and I'm figuring out what my teammates are capable of and what I'm capable of and what my opponents are capable of. This is something that competitive gamers are constantly interested in, is learning. And barring that, they want to improve. Not barring that, but with that considered, they want to improve. They want to take the lessons they've learned and find a way to do it better. They want to find a way to win based on what they've learned. And win, lose, draw, whatever, they want to be treated fairly. If a competitive gamer feels as though the game's treating them unfairly, the studio's treating them unfairly, their teammates or the opponents are treating them unfairly in some way, is going to cause some bitterness, is going to cause some problems. So these are the things that competitive gamers want. If they win, they generally want it to be a challenge. There's a phrase out there, some of you may have used it, some of you not, they'll say raffle stomp. rolling on the floor laughing, and then stomp put together, it basically means that this team is a joke. We're just rolling right over them. We're ignoring how good they are. Generally, there's some fun to be had in that, but generally when you go in and you compete, you're not really learning anything. You're not really improving if you're just stomping the team. So generally, if they win, they want it to be a challenge. And if they lose, they want to feel like it's for legitimate reasons. They want to understand why they lost, and they want to understand how to stop it from happening again. So when they go into it, if they feel like, I don't know why I lost, I just keep getting dominated, that's going to drive someone away from your game. If they understand why, but they don't understand how to stop it, or they feel like it's illegitimate, like I'm being unfairly treated here, they're going to walk away from your game also. So you can miss out on opportunities to capture your gamers if they're not being educated as to what's going on and why it's happening, and help them understand why they're winning and losing. So what we learned from this is that action should have meaning. If a player can do anything they want and still win, the game's boring. If they can do anything they want and never win, the game's pointless. So from a competitive gaming perspective, they're going to walk away from a game if it feels like it's treating them unfairly, if they feel like their actions don't have meaning. Also, if the actions have inconsistent results. If one time I shoot this weapon and it does one thing, another time I shoot this weapon and it does another, and I never know which one it's going to do, that means that the action doesn't have meaning. At least in a programming sense, you've got some code programmed in that says if they do A, B, C, or D can happen. But from a player standpoint, from their perception, there's no meaning to this. I don't know when to engage, when not to engage. I don't know when to fight, when not to fight, because this has inconsistent results. So they want to feel as though each choice has a bearing on what's going to happen in the match. If I go into a fight and I understand the mechanics of the game and I feel like I'm making a good choice here, and it turns out to be a bad choice because there was some information I didn't have, or because the other player made a better choice than I did, that's okay. But if I go into it and I feel like it's a good choice and it's just the game that cheats me, or if there's just some mechanic that doesn't make sense or that's random, a player's going to feel as though they're being cheated in that sense, and they're going to say, well, my choice had no bearing on the result here. The game was determined when we picked our characters. The game was determined when we selected the map. There's no reason for us to complete this. We ought to just leave. And that's going to create a bad experience for the rest of the players in the game. So your number one goal when you're designing something that's a competitive multiplayer experience is to design your game so that players always feel as though their choices are meaningful. And this goes back to everything that we've talked about before. They want to feel as though from the start of the game until the closing bell, or as close to the closing bell as you can get it, their choices have some bearing on the results of the game. They don't ever want to feel like they're down and out and it doesn't matter what they do now, they can never come back. The easiest way to achieve this is by properly balancing your game. And balance is a tricky subject because competitive gamers are always very concerned about it. If you go to any forum for a competitive game, they're constantly arguing with each other about what balance is. They're arguing with the developers about what balance is. We were talking about League of Legends before the game. They release a patch every 2 weeks, and every 2 weeks there's a total storm of topics about why the developers don't know what they're doing on the forum. So they're always concerned about this. This is something that they want to know and understand. But there's a problem here that gamers and developers don't often mean the same thing when they're talking about balance, and sometimes developers and other developers don't mean the same thing when they're talking about balance. Because there's a couple different ways you can define it, and there's a couple different ways you can look at it. So if you guys will work with me here, we're going to do a little thought experiment here. If you look at these two scales, which one do you guys think is balanced? The one on the right or the one on the left? The one on the right. Okay, so that right now we're saying that this scale on the right is balanced, right? Now, if we go to the next slide, I don't know if you guys can see there's 100 and a 50. There's 100 on the left-hand side bag and a 50 on the right-hand side bag. Now, which one of these scales is balanced? Why is there a difference between the one on the right and the one on the left in this instance? So there's different values here, right? We've got, in this instance, these scales are not weighing anything. They're blind to whatever situation's coming up. And the one on the right is actually balanced. If you come into my complete fictional store and you say, I have $100, I want an item please, and I put something that is worth $50 on the scale next to it, and my magic scales know the difference between weight and value, and it stays even, you're going to say, this scale on the right is not balanced. You're going to say, that scale's not balanced. It's not fair. I'm being treated unfairly. So there's kind of two thought processes here going into what balance is. So the top two are good. You want, when something is being actually weighed, you want the scale to fairly measure the difference between the two objects. When nothing is being weighed, when it's just blind to the situation, you want everything to be equal. These two are bad. If you put people on the scale together and they always come out even, that's either imbalanced or it's random. And you're going to see that in a lot of game designs, and this is one of those instances where I can say, you know what, this is a rule you can throw out sometimes. If you guys have played Mario Kart, right? You get into Mario Kart, you probably know where I'm going with this. You're in first place, you're kicking butt, everyone's back behind you, and all of a sudden, boom, blue shell hits you out of nowhere, because there's this shell you can't dodge that someone in last place can shoot up to the front to be a spoiler and ruin your experience. The closer the skill gap between players, the more frustrating that is. So if you're creating a system that's putting people together and letting them compete against one another where they're close in skill, those types of rubber band mechanics are incredibly frustrating because it makes the player feel as though their choices didn't have meaning up until that point. If there's a wide skill gap, which you might have in a party game like Mario Kart, a blue shell is entirely appropriate, because what it does is it lets everybody sit down and play, and if everyone's approaching it that this is for fun, this is not for competition, then a blue shell is great, because if I'm beating my wife and my brother in the game and my wife shoots a blue shell at me and I end up in last place and she ends up in second, she's having a great time. We're all having fun, right? So again, we're going back to that caveat, consider your audience and your goals with this. But in general, if we're talking about a competitive multiplayer experience, top two are good, bottom two are bad. They want to feel as though the system is treating them fairly in every interaction. And not only that, they want to feel as though the system is treating them fairly in every individual interaction, not over time. And that goes to this scale over here on the bottom right-hand side, where it's imbalanced like that, where we could kind of give an example of that is in leveling up or random rewards before the game starts. If what the game does is it sometimes gives you a reward when the game starts and sometimes gives them a reward when the game starts before it's measuring everybody, over time eventually that may even out. But competitive games are measured in individual instances, not over time. So for this situation where it's giving you an unfair advantage to the start of the match, that's going to make competitive gamers feel as though my choices have less meaning or no meaning because they got an advantage when the match started. I'm not getting any progress here. Again, that's something that if you want to put handicaps into the game, that's something players can choose to do, but it's not something that you want to build in that's forced onto players because that's going to limit the competitive potential of your game. So if you look at balance here, is the system going to treat me fair in a blind situation or where I'm preparing to play? When you're leveling, when you're getting in-game or random rewards, in character and map selection, when we go into the character selection, am I screwed if I get third pick? Is my team just ruined if I get last pick because there's not enough viable characters to select from? Or if we end up on a particular map, is the red team going to have a huge advantage over the blue team? In these instances where the system's blind, before it's actually measuring you, the system needs to treat you fairly. It needs to be balanced across the board. When it comes to team selection or matchmaking, this goes into your algorithm that selects who to match you up against. If it's matching incredibly high-level player against incredibly low-level players, then both groups are going to start to feel like their actions either have no meaning or less meaning. Because I go into play, and sometimes I do okay, and sometimes I get stomped. So the closer your team selection and matchmaking systems can get to keep players balanced with one another and give them interactions where they feel as though their actions are meaningful, the better things are. And then for those of you who may work on casual or social games, stuff with microtransactions, this again is not a hard rule. I've seen games that do this and they do okay, but try and not sell power. If you can go in and because you've got more money, you've got an advantage going into a game, that illegitimizes the competition. It says he has an unfair advantage from the start of the game because he's got more money than I do. It's not democratic, so to speak. If you do want to sell something, sell customization, sell perks, or even sell speed so that I level up more quickly than you, but if my matchmaking and my team selection system are still even, then even if I level up more quickly and I save time that someone else didn't have to invest because I've got more money, I'm still matched up with people that are of equal level and skill than I am. Now in this system, is the system treating me fairly when I'm competing against other players? If I go into single combat with somebody, is it going to fairly measure whether my skills are better than the other person's? If my team has better teamwork than their team does, is it going to fairly measure that? Same thing with decision making. And then this is another one, again, might not be a hard rule, but post-game rewards. Players want to feel as though I won, I should get more of something than the player who lost. And in competitive gaming, this can be kind of important. You're going to create a lot of bitterness if they go in and they compete and they work work really hard and they win, and then everybody gets the same thing. In a casual game and a social game, that might be fine, but you're going to create some frustration in players that, well, what's the point of me competing at this if they get the same rank points, they get the same currency, they get the same everything that I did for playing. All I'm doing is grinding. I'm not actually competing. I'm not actually leveling up or getting ahead of anybody. So the question here then is, what's the number one thing that gets in the way of balancing competitive games? And if I'm honest with myself, the answer is resources. Eventually you have to ship your title. Eventually you have to end it. Every game ships with bugs, they say. Every game ships with some imbalances in the multiplayer experience. There's no game that's ever really done in the mind of a game designer unless they're really ready to be done with it and move on. But we're going to put a pin in that because that's something that I can't handle. That's something that you guys have to deal with at a studio level, like I said at the beginning. I'm going to say that the number one thing is developer arrogance. And I want to use that word arrogance because it's strong. And I want you guys to leave this thinking about that word, developer arrogance. Am I being arrogant when I'm designing my game? A better word might be bias. If I'm trying to be gentle with you, do I have some bias, or do I have some blind spot, or do I have some deficiency? But really, developer arrogance is a big deal. And this happens a lot in competitive games because what you have is a guy like me who spent 15 years playing competitive games, and he's been a developer for how long, and then he goes in and he makes his own game and he says, this is my game, it's going to be played the way I want to, I've got the best ideas, I've got whatever. And this arrogance kind of works its way into the game. And maybe that dude is a really nice guy, but he's got really strong thoughts about what the game's supposed to be. And this can ruin a competitive game. So my quick definition for developer arrogance: when developers refuse to listen to the data, the community, or one particularly brilliant conference speaker to make adjustments to their designs. So what are we actually arrogant about? Metrics is the next point I wanted to talk about here, and this is something that I've seen a lot from developers, or it could also be called analytics. It's collecting data from a game and analyzing the generated information to improve design. If you guys were in the design track, there was a talk yesterday about trust as a game mechanic, and there was a lot of talk about analyzing the data that was in the system, and then the talk that came right after that was about qualitative methods, where you took data, but then as a designer you had to look at that and say, ask the right questions. You had to figure out what to use out of that data to improve your design. So this is something that I have had developers outright look at me and say, this doesn't matter, you have to trust the designer, not the data. The data's wrong because it's a group of players that are uneducated about what the game is or what it's about, or really, like, you can't really know, the game's too complex, so you can ignore the data in this instance. You have to trust the intuition of the developers. So developers believe that they're smarter than the data, or that it's irrelevant to their game somehow. This is one of the number one things that I've seen developer arrogance as a competitive gamer. Some studios, they don't have this problem. If you look at Bungie, those guys, not only they started doing this all the way back in Halo 2. They would play their games and they had this tool that would map where all of the kills came in, what weapons were used, what team was doing it, and then they made that tool public on their website so that you could go back and look at your game afterward and see where you died and who died and how many of the kills were. So obviously Bungie has a crazy amount of resources, being, with Microsoft and developing a big franchise like Halo 2. So this is something that they can do. And they're a good example to use when you want to convince somebody that, hey, metrics matter, because if you look at the Halo games, they're generally competitively very well balanced, and they're good experiences. So if you guys are having problems really grasping this idea, or you've got a producer or somebody that you're trying to pitch this idea to, there's a book that I highly recommend that you check out. It's called Moneyball, and it's actually about analytics applied to baseball. But Michael Lewis is one of the best nonfiction writers of this generation, and he had a really great story to tell here about how the Oakland Athletics defied conventional wisdom, went in and used analytics, and they were able to create a baseball team with one of the lowest payrolls in baseball that was one of the best teams in baseball. They made it into the playoffs 4 seasons in a row with one of the lowest payrolls in baseball. Whereas my poor Orioles had the highest payroll in baseball for 10 years during the 90s, and we never won a World Series. So basically what this book teaches you is that conventional wisdom can create success, but it's at great cost. If you're looking at the New York Yankees, they just throw money at whoever they want to buy. They get them on the team and they go, right? So if you want to go out there and buy the best players, or if you've got unlimited resources like we talked about before, you can just dump money into a game until it's great. You can bring in focus groups, you can play test the heck out of it. If you've got unlimited time and unlimited funds, you can do this. But if you're using metrics, metrics, and I use the word metrics and analytics interchangeably, even though they're a little bit different, because metrics matter. It rhymes, or it's got the nice flow there. But if you're using analytics, you can make better decisions. So it reduces your costs and it increases your efficiency. It lets you make better decisions more quickly. To answer the criticism of the game is too complex, the analytics don't apply, the data is there's too much data for us to sort through it. If you want to answer that question to somebody, you can say, well, if you build analytics tools in the games from the get-go, and you make it easy to add new data points to track, well then, if you have a question you want to ask, you can go back and you can look at that data. So sometimes there's a simple question that you couldn't answer if you didn't have those analytics tools built in. And so you'd have to go in and you have to spend more time as a designer answering that question. If you give yourself the ability to cross-reference points of data, which we were talking about the game League of Legends earlier, right? So let's say you think a particular character is overpowered in League of Legends. You say it's Taric. He's a healer. He's kind of an off-tank. He is a good character, and teams tend to win too often. We'll go in and look at the data and say, do teams tend to win more often? So you look at all the wins and you cross-reference it against Taric. Well, maybe the data doesn't really spell that out for you. You say, so why does he feel so powerful? Well, now you can compare Taric and his win ratio against what teammates are on his team, which side of the map he's on. Those sorts of things, you can start to compare them and you can start to identify problems. You can let your intuition read into the data and you can learn which questions to ask to find the answers to your questions. It also lets you look for patterns. If you're seeing that red team wins 65% of the time and blue team, doesn't win that often, then you can identify some of these patterns in your game and make adjustments accordingly. And then you can use this information to confirm or reject ideas that you've got about the design. You can go in and you can say, well, we think that X is a problem. Is it really a problem? And you can test that. What you can also do, though, is you can build that into your test server if you're dealing with a online game, whether that's a local server that you're running internally to your office, if it's a console game, or a PC game, if you just set up a special box that your development team can work on. And you can test on that some of the ideas that you've got using the analytics tools. And if you do have this, some suggestions that I have is to set up a development server and make it available to a certain portion of your audience. Because the more people that are getting on there and playing a little bit in your development environment, the better off that you are, the more you're going to be able to kind of identify potential problems with your design ideas. No designer is so brilliant that he can look at a game and tell you all the implications of a design change, especially the more complex it gets. So the more people that you can get in there and play the game, the better off you are. I'm going to say this, a lot of designers are going to disagree with me on this, but don't keep your design changes a secret. There are sometimes I see patches go into competitive games and the whole community facepalms right away. It's like, what are these guys thinking? And it's because they sat down in a room and they all talked about an idea and they said, okay, we want to implement this. It'll change the way the players play it by making them do X. Well, then they go in and they do it, and then everybody that's play testing it internally knows that that's the goal, right? So it corrupts the data. They go in and they say, yeah, I pushed less. I didn't push as hard. I didn't rush as much. I didn't camp as much. Well, yeah, because that was your idea and you think this is the answer to it. So you've already kind of pre-biased the information. So by getting people out there to test your game and by not keeping the design changes a secret, you give yourself an opportunity to glean information from your community and make your game better. Also provide incentives to your community to get on there and play for you. If you're playing a game that's got virtual currency, say once a week you give them a bonus currency exchange if they get on and play on the test server a couple of games for you. This gives them a reason to go on and give you good data, and it doesn't corrupt their play experience at all. They can still go back to the other one, and it gives you a chance to make better content for them. And then kind of as like a super side point, if you have an active competitive community, try and avoid or delay introducing new content or tweaks to your game if there's a major tournament coming up. This is something that's hard to consider because you obviously got production schedules and you've got a lot of other things to think about, but it's helpful. It makes the tournaments run a lot more smoothly. So kind of playing on that idea of the test server, player investment is incredibly important. No matter how much or how hard you try, how much money you spend, or whatever resources that you've got, you can't keep up with player investment. There's always going to be this collective consciousness. We talked about yesterday about the player. The player's kind of the idea that he was presenting yesterday was that the player is the collective consciousness of all the players that are playing your game, playing all the possible paths, right? So you can't keep up with that fictional player, right? You can't, because they're going to put more time into it. So here's a hypothetical for you. Let's say your QA team has 20 full-time testers. And let me tell you, even at a decent-sized studio, this might be pushing it sometimes. Sometimes they narrow the team down and they build it back up when they're getting into gold master phase. But let's say you've got 20 full-time testers making $15 an hour. So that means once a week, you're spending 800 man-hours of testing work. And that's assuming that they're not sitting in pointless meetings or playing foosball or whatever else testers do sometimes. So if you're patching on a 1-month cycle, that means that's 3,200 hours and $48,000 that you're spending on testing. If they're testing for bugs, regressing old bugs, and testing for balance, they're not getting to all of the balance testing that you might want to have happen in that instance. So if you add in your design team, they're like dedicated time to really play balance, you're looking at maybe 4,000 hours per patch that you're investing. Now let's look at your players. In the first hour your game is live, if we say you have a modest 20,000 people playing your game, and for a lot of developers out there, if you sell 20,000 copies of your game, you're really excited. But if you look at a lot of competitive multiplayer games, at the very least you're seeing like a 50,000 or 100,000 or 150,000. If you're talking about something like Halo, you've got millions, right? But so very modest, 20,000 players playing your game, and each of them plays for 1 hour. That means that in the first hour, 20,000 hours of testing time, or 5 times what you're able to get for $48,000, is invested into your game. At that rate, you get over $1 million in free testing, basically, in the first 24 hours your game is live. And those players, they're testing paths and ideas and interactions that your developers and your designers never thought of testing, let alone had time to. Right? So there's all these thousands of hours being dumped into your game. If you're not gleaning data from that, and if you're not learning from what your community is learning from that, then you're basically throwing money away. I mean, think about it. In 24 hours, if you threw $1 million away, how mad would your producer be at you? So some lessons that we get from player investment: at any given moment, your community of players probably understands better how to win at your game than you do. They might not understand all of the interactions at the programming level, or all of the art, or all of the lore, or any of that better than you do, but they probably understand how to win at your game better than you do. And the players are going to min-max your game. They're going to push it to its limits. They're going to figure out what the minimum investment for the maximum reward is, and they're going to disrupt balance. What you think is balance, they're going to disrupt it. They're going to narrow the options. They're going to narrow the path. But don't blame the players for this. Encourage them to break it and learn from it. You can make a better game if you're learning from them, rather than trying to fight them all the time and tell them they shouldn't be doing something, they shouldn't be breaking it, they shouldn't be, like, quote-unquote exploiting it to get ahead. And if you make mistakes, own up to them and fix them as fast as you can. Don't punish the players for your mistakes. Get in there and make changes if you can. Another thing to think about here is game rules. This is another thing, big time, developers get very arrogant about. If your rules suck, players are going to make up their own. You see this in the world of Pokemon, right? In Pokemon, they've got all these moves that put everybody to sleep. So the competitive Pokemon community, they say, we've got a special rule, only one Pokemon on each team can be put to sleep at any given time. So that's something that they introduced themselves to make the game more competitive viably. And they've got all sorts of other ones. The Pokemon's incredibly complex, and they do lots of stuff to make their game competitive. But you should consider yourself lucky if this is actually happening, because what it means is that you've got a really cool core design, but you dressed it up wrong. Like I said before, with player investment, your players probably know better how to win at your game than you do, and they know better how to have fun with your game than you do, probably, at least for them. If you say, no, this is the way you play my game, and they say, well, that's not fun, I'm going to go play something else, well, you lost a customer there. If you can give them options, and if you support these new rules in your future patches and sequels, then you're going to capture more players. They're going to be playing your game, thinking about your game, and giving you more money. So when you're creating a multiplayer game, I want you guys to think about yourself as creating a toy. You want to create a situation where the player can engage it how they want to, as much as possible, not a set of rules. So a lot of developers say, here's my game, it's a set of rules, you're going to follow these rules and you're going to have fun. Instead of saying, here's a game with some rules and some options, go nuts with it, figure it out, do the best that you can. And if you look at stuff like the old StarCraft game, StarCraft, all those mods that came out for it gave rise to whole new genres of games. So your players sometimes can come up with things that you never thought of. And again, it's free design dollars. It's free marketing dollars for you. If you can tap your community, especially in these game rule situations, you can create better experiences for your players. So another thing that I've had developers actually like, oh gosh, like no, I would never do that. Give everything an off switch. I cannot tell you how many games have been ruined because a developer decided that something had to be in it and you couldn't turn it off. One of the games that I played competitively about 2 years ago was The Conduit. It was a first-person shooter for the Wii. I was very interested in the motion controls for a first-person shooter. I had played Halo and some other games competitively as a shooter before. But The Conduit eventually ground into just being a dead game that you couldn't play competitively because they did not give you the option to turn off the radar. So if you moved, a red dot showed up, somebody knew where you were. And so it incentivized players to camp and to hide. And so what ended up happening was teams would start the game, they'd all run into their base, collect their weapons, and they'd sit there and poke and shoot at each other. And it became an incredibly boring, worthless game to play competitively because some designer somewhere decided that it wasn't worth the 30 minutes it would take an engineer to code an off switch onto the radar. That's in a situation where developer arrogance it cost them a lot of opportunities to make their game last a lot longer competitively. Another thing to consider is controller options. Let players completely customize their controllers if you can. Don't worry about them creating an advantage. If they do, other players are going to copy it or they're going to find other opportunities to do it. And if you can support those special control settings, they give them advantages later on. If you can let them completely customize their controller, that's the best way. And I'm going to give you a good example why. This right here is called the Nomad controller. It's a modified controller. And it allowed players with disabilities who couldn't handle the shoulder buttons to play games that otherwise would be impossible for them to play. And this control is called Nomad because of this gentleman. His name's Randy Fitzgerald, and I had the opportunity to play with him and interview him when I worked for Major League Gaming. He was born with arthrogryposis, I think is how you say it, and basically he didn't have use of his arms or legs, and or very limited use, and he couldn't play normally, so he actually learned to play with his face. And he had this Nomad controller specially designed for him that allowed him to play and compete in your game. So there's actually a fighting game player out there in Texas who competes in Super Smash Brothers and in Street Fighter, very high level, one of the top 10 players in Texas who has the same condition, can't use his arms, he plays with his face. And the reason why they're able to compete in these games is because the developers gave them the option to completely customize their controls. Some of them had to go and get modded controllers, but if you just say, okay, well, go get a modded controller and you can do that, basically what you're doing is you're taking money that they would be spending on your game and giving it to a controller modder, right? So this is money that you could be capturing for your audience or for your studio that you're otherwise just throwing away if you're not giving them this option. So some design concepts here that we should learn as I'm nearing the end of this. Risk versus reward is an important concept when you're dealing with competitive gamers. Items, and this might seem obvious, but it's something good to think about and talk about. Items and abilities that have a high reward should also have a high risk associated with them or some type of limitation holding them back. So an example might be a rocket launcher that has only 2 cartridges in it, or a sniper that is hard to fire if you're under fire, those sorts of things. You want to make them take a risk to get something really good, because if you give them something really good for no risk at all, that's all they're going to do. It limits their choices. It makes the choices feel meaningless. It's like, well, the first person who gets to the rocket launchers wins the game, right? So what your game really is it's the first 30 seconds that the game starts, and then the rest of the game is determined by who got to the rocket launcher. I want to apologize if anyone from Epic is in here. I'm going to use an example from Gears of War 1. That satellite gun that was in that game, basically certain maps where that satellite gun was on, the whole game boiled down to we start the game, we rush out to positions, and we try and jockey for control of that satellite gun. Once a team got that satellite gun, the choices the rest of the other team made were almost meaningless at that point, because you could just sit someplace secure and shoot that satellite gun down on them anytime they try to advance on you. So at that point, your choices become meaningless, and it gets rid of our number one goal that we talked about at the beginning. So you want to put some type of drawback into there. Same thing with important map locations. If your goal in a game is to defend a base, don't put all of the ammo and power-ups and everything else that a team needs inside that base for them. We were talking about Conduit before. That's a perfect example. In Conduit, where your spawns were, there were tons of weapons, right? So players had no reason to leave the base, especially once they had an advantage. And assaulting those positions was incredibly difficult because they had all these maps that were inside, and they had little tiny windows, and it was easy to sit in the window and throw grenades when they approached, and then back up when they threw grenades and collect more. And you had unlimited ammo that you could just keep throwing at them. There was no reason for you to try and assault a team or any reason to leave your base. So you want to look for ways to give players choices about risk versus reward. This is one of the best ways that you can create some texture to the gameplay. Do I go to this side of the map that is incredibly risky, that I might be seen, I might be shot, I might be knocked off the map for a chance to get a hold of that powerful weapon and bring it back to my team? Or do I stay the safe route and go where there's cover and try and assault the other team, even though there's a possibility that I'm going to get hit when I get there? It's potentially lower reward. So something else to learn is that if given a choice, players will generally select a low-risk option or a no-risk option, even if it takes much longer and it requires lots of grinding. This goes back to the camping example I was saying. It is no fun to sit in a base with ammo and just throw grenades all day. But if you're competing in a league and you want to win, that was higher up on the list than a lot of the other stuff. And so if you've learned that I want to win the game and it's going to make me top of the league, then players are going to do that. If in a fighting game, all you have to do is sit back and hit a low kick over and over again, and the other guy can never get at you, you're going to do that. And you're going to do that and win, because sometimes you're playing in a tournament and money's on the line, or rank points are on the line, or pride is on the line. So players are generally going to be okay with grinding or patience, at least for a time, to play that low risk or no risk reward. And if that behavior is constantly rewarded, your game's going to become stagnant and boring. What's going to happen is, over time, the viable options are going to get narrowed down by this player base, by your community, until they say, the only choice that I have is to go in, play this one character, and do low kick over and over again. And the person who's best at doing low kick is the person that's going to win the match. At that point, the player does not have meaningful choices about how to play your game unless they create their own rules, unless they change things specially to knock those players out. And hopefully, they'll do that if that's what your game boils down to. But eventually, they're going to go away. They're going to find something that's more fun, that gives them more interesting choices to make. So how do you avoid stagnation in your competitive games? Treat power and safety as yin and yang. We've already kind of talked about this. Don't put ammo in a defensible spot. Don't put a power weapon someplace that it's easy to get. Don't put spawn points right next to power weapons. Think about those sorts of things so that you separate players' safety from the power, so they have to take risks to go out and achieve goals. Include objectives if you can at all. If you look at League of Legends, we were talking about earlier, some of the most dynamic things that happen in that game are around the objectives on the map. So generally, you want to stay in lane, you want to level up, you want to shoot some monsters and get some gold. There's 3 lanes in those maps, and so players, they'll go in and they'll stay in their lane forever if you let them, because that's low risk, high reward. Eventually, you've collected enough gold that you can go buy some items, you can beat the other team. But by putting objectives on the map, they've got 2 in the middle of the map, it forces teams to leave their lanes and to think about other things: positioning, spacing, getting kills at the right times, pressing and retreating. And if you're going to include those objectives, if you can, put them in high risk or less traveled areas. It encourages players to be in motion. And that's something that you want to do. You want to reward players for activity. If you reward them for staying still, they're going to stand still. You don't want to encourage them to stand still, because that's not gameplay. That's just staying put, right? It's, if I stay right here, you're never going to get me, so I'm going to stay right here and win the game. So you want to reward players for their activity. I think there's a game out there called Painkiller that's played on the PC, and it was pretty competitive for a while. One of the things that they did was players got a speed bonus for every second that they were in motion, right? So you could camp if you wanted to, but eventually the guy that was running around the map would be moving so fast you couldn't hit him. So it encouraged you to stay in motion constantly. And so that mechanic allowed them to make their game not stagnant. It made it active. And it made players rely on their skill and their abilities to win. Odd-numbered teams is a good way to go, or at least make it so that if your teams are even, the objectives or the map locations are odd. If the objectives and map locations are even, make the teams odd. So what you do here is you create opportunities for players to create asymmetrical warfare, right? So if you've got a map that's got 3 lanes and you put 5 people on the map, that means that there's going to be 2 people in one lane, 2 people in another lane, and 1 person in a third one. So if you switch that around, now you give teams interesting choices about where they position players to fight each other. If you can build hard counters into your game design, that's one of the best ways to check something from becoming impossibly powerful. And that's a lesson we can learn from Pokemon also. They've got really basic, you've got a type advantage, right? If I'm a water type Pokemon, you want to hit me with what? Does anybody know? Grass type, right, or electric type. So even if they introduce a super powerful Pokemon that's water type, and he's got all sorts of awesome moves, if you can put somebody in the game that can hit him with a really powerful grass type move, he gets knocked out. So there's these automatic checks and balances, and if you've actually ever followed the Pokemon competitive scene, which I would bet none of you in this room have, dragons are generally considered very powerful. Game Freak likes to give them very high stats. Well, dragons are weak to ice. So ice-type attacks are everywhere. They stick them on every Pokemon. You've got a grass Pokemon, he's got an ice move. You've got whoever, they've got an ice move, because it gives them an opportunity to check those dragons and keep them from running away and dominating the game. Avoid circles. If players, again, this goes back to the whole stagnation thing. If players can just run in circles and avoid combat, they will do it. So look for ways to disrupt circle running, or just don't put a circle in your game at all. Build in escapes. This is something that you can learn from fighting games. There's certain fighting games where infinites happen, right? You learn a combo and you keep somebody juggled the whole time. That's not a whole lot of fun. Maybe the guy who's doing it is having fun, but the guy who's getting it done to him is not having fun. So there are certain fighting games where there's a built-in escape of some sort. There's like a burst move or something that if you get hit a certain number of times, you can activate it, it breaks the combo, and you reset. So look for ways to build that into your design so that no one thing becomes incredibly overpowered. And when in doubt, balance towards offense. It's better to let it become a total mess of constant offense than to let it become a snore fest, to let players back off and just play defense. You would rather it be chaotic and constant conflict than boring and not interesting, because you're more likely to keep players for longer with a chaotic, fast-paced offense game than you are a defensive game, even if neither of them are particularly balanced. The last thing we really need to talk about is measuring skill. Remember, we talked about meaningful choices. We also talked about balance, right? When the players actually get on the scale, they want the balance to tip in their favor if they're better. And if they get better, they want to see that balance start to work its way back, to even. So they want to feel as though the game measures some type of skill. They want to feel as though if they're making better choices than the other guy, then they're winning the games. So one thing that you can do to help keep skill in your game is to avoid what I would call anti-fun abilities. Abilities that may be fun for one person, but not fun for another, or abilities that are just not fun, but they provide power. So something that provides power without gameplay, let's say you just press a button and all of a sudden your player's super powerful. That doesn't give the guy who's playing against it anything to do but run away, right? So it doesn't, if an ability is not as much fun to play against as it is to play with, then it's probably not a great ability. There's probably a better choice that you can make. If the abilities bypass the skill component of some time and just give somebody something good, that's probably not a great ability. I put here joy buttons need not apply. In social and casual gaming, they talk about a joy button, right? There's just something that you do that you get a reward for no matter what you do, how you do it, whatever. If you're designing social casual, if you're just designing a fun, like I'm going to make a kart racer for the kids or something like that, it's a good choice to have a joy button in there. People like that. But in a hardcore competitive game, joy buttons, they've got no place. And like I said before, abilities that are more frustrating to play against they are to use. The net fun in the system should be positive when you introduce something, right? So if you introduce an ability that puts something invisible on the map that blows you up and you can't fight against it at all and the guy who puts it down just gets to laugh at you, that's a bad ability. That's something that is anti-fun. It's fun for that guy, but not a whole lot of fun, and it's really frustrating for the guy who gets blown up by it. So the net fun in the system goes down when you introduce something like that. Also, I know some of you might be tabletop gamers and you'd be really mad at me about this, but percent-based effects have no place in a competitive game. If you can work them out at all, get rid of them. If you have the option between making an ability that gives, let's say your ability says, this is going to give bonus magic damage 25% of the time. It's better to make it the same skill that says, every fourth attack, this is going to give bonus magic damage. It's going to give the same bonus magic damage. Because now what you've got is instead of something that happens randomly and might happen 3 times in a row to give you a huge advantage, or not happen at all for 10 attacks and give you a disadvantage, now it's something that you can know about, you can plan for, and you can build into your skill set. So one of the best ways to create depth and longevity in your game is to measure skill across a variety of skill gradients, right? Some of these are going to be more narrow than others. Some of them are going to be broader. Some games are going to require higher dexterity and just a little bit of strategy. Some games are going to require a whole lot of strategy and just a little bit of dexterity, that sort of thing. So some types of skills that we can talk about: dexterity, that's your ability to press buttons quickly or in a certain combination. Reflexes, your ability to react to something that happens. Awareness is something that I think professional gamers tend to have that your average gamer doesn't. They know what's going on the map, what's going on with their teammates, where they need to look, where they need to shoot. They've got awareness that nobody else has. This is a skill that is often completely overlooked, not just by players, but also by developers. And they'll accidentally get it into their game, and then they don't really understand it, and people are using it for an advantage. And then they have to go back and really kind of learn what the pro gamers have learned about awareness and positioning. Positioning is something like, if I am standing at just outside the range of your ability, and I can work my way in and make you think you can hit, and I can back up, and then you miss, and then I go in and fight you. That's a positioning thing, and that's incredibly important in almost all competitive games. There's a few other on here that I think speak for themselves. Your ability to solve problems, your precision, like aiming. So if you can get multiples of these, instead of having, here's my skill gradient, right? My game is about dexterity. It's who can memorize this 100-hit combo before the other guy and get it off, right? So it's all about dexterity and a little bit about positioning. The first guy who makes a mistake on positioning gets a 100-hit combo, he loses the match, right? If you can create a matrix where instead of just this, it's measuring across a variety of skills. Now you've created depth, and you've given your game an opportunity to last a long time. Because what happens is players get really good on one skill, but they might be weak on another. So it requires them to keep growing across a variety of skill gradients instead of just one. And that's going to create a much better experience for your players. And I think, okay, here we go. Summary of advice. So make your choices meaningful. Number one, if there's anything you take away from this, make the choices for the gamers meaningful. Look for ways so that they never say, I only have one choice, or I only have two choices. Give them as many meaningful choices as you can. Treat players equally until they actually start competing against one another, and then brutally examine them against one another. Again, not a hard rule. It's something that you might ignore if you're making something that is geared towards more casual players, or it might be something that you put into the game, but then you give them options, like we talked about, where they can handicap themselves, or they can put in some fun tools. Build in analytics tools and be humble about the results they give you. Utilize your community. It's like printing money. Every studio has resource issues. Almost every studio has resource issues. But even the ones that are huge and have lots of money, sometimes you want to ramp up a project and you have to hire people and you have to find the right people. So I'm going to go back and say every studio has resource issues. So don't throw it away. Use your community. Learn from them. Whether it's what they say on the forums or what you're learning from the data, use it. And you have to learn to have a thick skin about that also, because a lot of times there's going to be a huge section of your community that are wrong and the data is going to prove them wrong. So you need to be okay with them telling you how terrible you are and what an awful designer you are, and learn to make good judgments about what the data is telling you about the game. Give players options. Everything needs an off switch. In fact, let's go back to the beginning where I said all of these are suggestions, not hard rules. This is the exception to the exception. If you can give everything an off switch, you're going to make a way better game. So give everything an off switch. That's the only hard rule that I'm going to give you from this whole thing. Power and safety are opposites. Don't mix them. Measure a variety of skill types to increase depths, and encourage competition everywhere. If your studio's got the resources, set aside a team, and their job is just to balance. They're going to compete against one another. They're going to set up competitions internally in the office. They're going to set up play tests outside of the office. If you can afford it, hire an esports manager and get them out there to encourage your studio's games in the competitive community and learn from it. You're going to make better games if you can do that. So, does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
I'm going to make an observation. I design board games and card games that are published. And much of what you're saying is something that we've known there for decades.
Yeah.
But the standard video game is a puzzle, not a game. You're competing against the challenges set up by the designers. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where the designer arrogance comes from. Because they used to have to decide this all ahead of time, and then they'd make the game and put it out. They didn't really get much chance to test it. Now people are starting to figure out, we need to test this game. We need to have people play this game, and not just people in our studio, but people everywhere play this game before we put it out, or it's going to suck because people are going to find things to do that we didn't think of.
Right.
But you pose it very, very well by putting it in terms of competitive multiplayer games.
Great, thank you. I appreciate it. You had one?
Recently, the producer of Street Fighter, he said that with the balance of arcade and Street Fighter 4 Arcade Edition, that he purposely made it unbalanced in order to encourage maturity in the community. How do you feel about people like those type of decisions? That guy told like, oh, that's understandable what he's saying. Yeah. That's why.
He can say he purposely made it imbalanced or whatever, but like I said before, no designer is so smart that he understands every implication of the game, particularly with a game like Street Fighter or Halo or Gears of War or League of Legends or any of those titles. You can't understand every implication. So maybe he said that, maybe he's just saying it because he can, or if he really did mean it, then that's disappointing because it means that there's some characters that you just don't have meaningful choices about, or you have to create your own rules to have meaningful choices from them. But I wouldn't particularly design that way. Now, I think there is room for joke characters, right? So you've got Dan in the old Street Fighter games, right? He wore a pink gi and he was really weak. Or you had Pichu in Super Smash Bros. Melee. I think there's room for fun stuff like that, but it's a choice. It's not forced on the player.
That's what, actually, I feel I do something similar because I purposely build imbalance into games, especially if they're character-based, because I feel that it creates villains and it creates underdogs. Mm-hmm. And so like Ono talking about imbalancing Street Fighter, you create like someone to hate, and when you beat them, it makes that win feel better. Mm-hmm. And also if you lose against them, it sort of makes you feel better because you're like, oh well, he was playing Sagat, whatever, I didn't really lose. and so I was just curious how you feel like in competitive scene, do you feel that like the joy that somebody can feel from winning as an underdog, can sort of outweigh a little bit of imbalance, like purpose?
I think it goes back to kind of the anti-fun situation. If, like I said, I don't think you can avoid imbalance. It's going to get into your game. I mean, there are games that patch every 2 weeks or every week, and the game's still like there are best picks and there are worst picks, So I don't think you can avoid imbalance, So if you want to utilize that to tell a fun story, or if that does end up creating some great moments for players, then that's awesome. I remember playing in a Super Smash Bros. Tournament against one of the best Samus players in the world, and I beat him one round. And I was like, yes! So I see what you're going with that, Like, I got a win there. That's awesome. Generally, what you want to do is give your players more meaningful choices. So the more you can balance, the more meaningful choices they have, and the more interesting the combat is. But, like I said, if you give them a choice, if you give them options, then that's fine. The problem is that at the top level, if you create that imbalance up, like overpowered characters, now they feel like their choices have been narrowed. If you give them some characters on the bottom that are meant to be weaker and imbalanced, and you're making that on the bottom, now it makes them feel as though, if you look at it like a pyramid, right? Down here at the bottom, it's wider, there's more choices or whatever, so you give them these weaker characters on the bottom, that's fine. If you're going up to the top and you narrow it, now you're narrowing choices and you're giving them fewer options.
I like to think balance is like it's not 50-50, strip peaks and valleys, so when you get these sort of like underdog matches, it's kind of worth it.
Yeah, it's exciting. It's exciting when those things do happen in games. And like I said, you can't avoid, ideally you want perfect balance across the board. You want the players to determine, not the characters, not the game mechanics, whatever. You want the players to determine who wins and who loses. But since that exists in games, it creates lots of great experiences. Who doesn't like watching the underdog win the Super Bowl, right? It's that sort of thing. So there are good things that can come from imbalances, but it's something that you want to minimize or at least make it a player choice instead of something that the players are forced to deal with.
I think it works like character selection based.
Yeah.
Outside that.
Yeah, as long as there's enough viable options so everyone who's involved in that individual instance, like we talked about before, they want to be treated as every individual instance is fair to them. If there's enough characters for them to select from that every individual instance is fair, then yeah, go for it.
When you look at the character feedback on balance, does a player's skill level increase the legitimacy of their concerns? Like if it's a player that's in the top 10% of all the players in your competitive community, do you feel like their concerns would be more valid than your average or low skill level player?
The answer to that is yes and no. You want to try and balance across all skill gradients. And actually, I went out to lunch with Chris yesterday, who spoke, Chris Hazard, he spoke in the morning about the statistics and all that. And we were talking about this specific problem. You have to balance across all skill gradients. And in League of Legends, actually, there are some stealth champions that at low levels just stomped players. It was just because they didn't understand it. At high level, you could coordinate with your teammates. You could build items that would reveal the stealth characters, so they were particularly weak at the high level, but they were particularly strong at the lower level. So they still had to nerf them down, even though they weren't good at the high level. So your goal is going to be to make the choices meaningful for as much of your audience as you possibly can. So yes, if somebody's totally overpowered at the high level and everyone below them, everyone below the top 10% doesn't get it and isn't getting it, eventually they will, right? So you want to balance to that top 10% if you can, but at the same time, you have to balance to the bottom, because what happens is the bulk of your community, bulk of your player base is down here, and the rest of them are up on top. And barring that education trickling its way down and those players getting better at certain skills, like that balance has to go across the board. So look at players, if you're looking at the statistics, like I was talking about, giving yourself an opportunity to cross-reference across different statistics. If you give yourself that option, what you can do is you can say, is this true in this band of players? Is this true in this band of players? Is it true in this band of players? So then you can bounce across a variety of skill levels. Actually, they just came in and gave me it's time. I need to let you guys go. So thank you very much. I have some business cards up here, and I'll answer some questions if anybody wants to come up and chat with me. But thank you very much for coming out this morning, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.